This book that I've written is mostly based on my experiences and observations, where I've seen medium scale enterprises achieve greater success with scaling agility, and the really big ones struggling quite a bit. And so a lot of even some of the stories that I'm going to share with you are inspired by real life, but of course I've changed them here and there to bring out the essential points and leave out the rest. And when I talk about IT organization design, I'm referring to mostly the development organization, so the CTO's organization or the CDO's organization, and less with respect to infrastructure teams or the CIO's organization. And if there is one key takeaway that I would like you to go away with, it is that of course we pay a lot of attention to engineering and process, and they are crucial, important, essential to get right. But when if you want to achieve overall IT responsiveness and improve the reputation of IT in the eyes of the business, then they are necessary, engineering and process, but not sufficient. And we really need to seriously consider organizational agility and organization design as a basis for making that happen. And during the course of the next, say, 30 to 40 minutes, I'll be sharing some of the key messages that I try to convey in the book, and there are others as well which we can maybe catch up offline as per your interest. And also in my experience, it has been that, you know, independent, so I classify IT organizations, their businesses that they belong to, as independent software vendors on one hand, internet businesses, and the third is classic enterprise IT, where IT is serving more of a traditional business. And as we might expect, the first two are somewhat ahead of the curve when it comes to enterprise agility, organizational agility, and enterprise IT is where a lot of room for improvement still exists. Strategic IT, it of course needs engineering and process, but for overall IT responsiveness and for overall this perception to change from business that IT is problematic and all that, we really need what I call as organizational agility, and there are structural, operational, cultural, political aspects to this. I'll at this point take an example. And so let me ask the audience here, are you familiar with this practice called DevBox testing? Have you heard of DevBox testing? If you can raise your hands. Okay, so in case, so I'll quickly introduce this concept. This is more of an agile software development team practice, where you have this notion of developers, they work on a story, and they call it complete, and then it moves on to the tester's queue. The question is it really complete? Is it good enough to move on to the tester's queue? Because if it's like self-certified by the developer as dev complete, it often happens that there is a lot of back and forth between the tester and the developer, because when the tester tries to deploy it into their environment, they might find that they can't even access that functionality, or maybe there is a misunderstanding with respect to acceptance criteria and so on, and so it bounces back and forth between developer and tester. And to avoid this, we recommend this practice called DevBox testing, which is nothing but when a developer feels he or she is done with a story, they call over an analyst, a tester or a business analyst, to quickly verify that whatever the major things, the happy parts in the story are done. And once they give a thumbs up, that's when you can consider it officially goes into the tester's queue, right? And so, this seems like a relatively straightforward thing to adopt. So what do you imagine could possibly come in the way of, instituting a practice like this within a big organization? Yes?
The test specialists are in a different country.
All right, yes, that's one possible reason.
They're not allowed to sit with developers.
They're not allowed to sit with developers, yes. And so we've been on, on different consulting engagements. My team and I, we've encountered this in, not infrequently. And I'll summarize some of the reasons here. One is that QAs say, but I need to know, I need to know when I'm going to be invited to test. A developer cannot just ad hoc call me during the day and say, I'm done with my story and will you please spend 10 minutes with me. So they are used to working in a very sort of scripted collaboration sort of way. Everything is via scheduled meetings and so on. It doesn't really have to be so within a single development team. Within a team, if you're working in an agile fashion, you don't have to give one day notice for these kind of activities. The other reason I've encountered, this is deeper actually, where they say, if the tester or analyst representative says, if I sit with a developer, how am I going to record the bugs, the things that I find out? Because I need to record them, I need to have traceability. And when I say that, this is more of like a sanity check, something that the developer himself or herself should ideally do, but you're just providing another pair of eyes. And only when it officially comes into the test queue, you need to worry about recording them and achieving traceability and so on. But they're not very happy with this answer. And the other thing I suggest is, as people who perform test-driven development, if there is an issue, then I as a developer, before writing the code to fix that, I am expected to write a failing unit test and then write the code to fix that issue, and thereby now I have an automated test that provides that traceability. It's part of my regression suite. So so we are good even though we haven't recorded it in a defect tracking system. And then it turns out actually that in some cases where there is still people are not convinced, that actually, though it looks like one team, the developers belong to a development organization within the company and the QAs QA organization, and they have different KPIs. So in one case it transpired that the QAs have a KPI, number of defects reported per QA per week, right? And that you can only get credit for that if it's recorded in the defect tracking system. So no wonder the QAs weren't too happy about like finding these bugs for free and and also it's this whole thing about this thing that we have about documenting bugs is more important than fixing them. That goes against the agile principle of working software over comprehensive documentation. So there is a tendency for organizations to think that they are agile because they are following certain practices, but actually if you dig deeper, they have not really internalized some of the principles. And that's why when we have these sort of conversations, we come across all these resistance. And this is not typically something that the teams can resolve by themselves, because this involves, okay, why are we part of two different departments? Why are there KPIs like this, right? And why is there a separate process quality group who says that this is what constitutes effective traceability? If you write code, it's not traceability. If you put it in the defect tracking system, it's traceability. And if you don't do this, there are some places where actually these quality audits happen and you get a non-conformance report because you're not logging each and every bug that you find. And so what are the things that come in the way when I talk about, there's an example of organizational agility, the collaboration culture. Like I can only collaborate via meeting invitations, or the ideology that we prioritize documentation, comprehensive documentation over working software. Or the structure, the way the teams are structured. IT matrices are a very good example of a structure coming in the way of overall IT responsiveness. Because IT itself is a function, right? When you look at the business as a whole, and an IT matrix is a functional organization within a function. And I've come across time and again this issue that responsiveness suffers as a result. And then the whole notion of how you come up with metrics, right? But this is a side effect of what I call as a scale-up style management, and I'll refer to this in forthcoming slides, which is that you have these, you start off with good business level outcome KPIs, but as you cascade them down the organization, they turn into these activity KPIs, which is like how many defects found per QA per week. and people start to optimize for those things and therefore compromise the larger outcomes. And therefore, I try to represent it this way, that to scale Agile, we need organizational agility, we need engineering and process by all means. Yeah, they're very important, but they're necessary but not sufficient. And to get there, to get to organizational agility, what we really need is some sort of deliberate look at the design of the organization, the structure, operations, culture, politics of the organization, some sort of deliberate intervention to set things up in such a way that then organizational agility can come about. And this is, so when we talk about scaling, right, a lot of people talk about scaling, but I want to draw a distinction between, just like we talk about in technical architectures, are you scaling vertically or horizontally, right? And they are both probably, depending on the context, legitimate ways of scaling. And what I've found is some popular frameworks, what they sort of implicitly advocate is the scale up, vertical scaling style of scaling, which really, in my opinion, doesn't help the cause of scaling agility truly. And therefore, I talk about scaling by scaling out, because Agile is heavily dependent on individuals and interactions. And what sorts of individuals and interactions? It needs motivated individuals and unconstrained interactions. Right? And what sort of organizational climate is going to help this? Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive about workforce motivation, and he has some nice TED Talks available online as well, where he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose as the three ingredients for an organizational climate of intrinsic motivation, right? We can talk about targets, incentives, and so on as other motivating mechanisms, but they are really extrinsic to the work, they are extrinsic motivation, and they don't generally tend to function as well in the sort of environment, in the sort of, for the sort of collaboration and sort of behaviors we now seek. And to get to intrinsic motivation, I think IT leadership can look at the design of the organization deliberately and see if there are things that are coming in the way of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And once you have autonomous teams, obviously the immediate fear is, oh, they are going to run away and do their own thing. They are, we are going to face alignment issues, or we are going to face issues of accountability, and I'll address them shortly. But the thing about autonomous teams is that you can't scale up autonomous teams. You can't sort of micromanage them with KPIs and metrics and these kind of regular reporting kind of things that we do. What really works best is you make sure that they are autonomous for meaningful things, that they are responsible for business outcomes. So for example, a product-centric team is a good example of providing autonomy to a team, whereas just a testing team or just a support team is probably not a good idea to provide autonomy to a testing team or a support team, because they are going to use that autonomy to optimize the testing service or the support service, right? Whereas a product-centric team, if it's responsible for a product and you have business outcomes attached to the success of the product, then they can make better use of their autonomy. And so I'll quickly go through four major points of what I mean by scale-out management, and for the rest of the talk I'll just focus on the first two. So organizing around outcomes, assigning outcome owners, and giving them autonomy. I kind of touched upon this already. And then to balance that autonomy, to ensure that autonomy does not lead to silos and to runaway autonomy and to other undesirable behaviors, we have to balance it out with mechanisms for alignment and accountability. And the third aspect is more of something that Barry already refers to in his lean enterprise, approving funds against objectives rather than detailed plans. And this is possible when you have fast feedback. When you don't have fast feedback, if you're only going to get feedback, say a year down the line, then you can't wait that long to see if the money that is being spent is is providing results or not. So you have to do a lot of, even though speculative, but you still have to do a lot of upfront sort of business case justification and so on. But once you get to a stage where you have fast feedback, then your planning horizon can be as short as the feedback horizon, and so you can quickly reassess how things are going and then plan for the next cycle. And yes, the fourth big thing is the metrics regime, which I've already somewhat touched upon. But yeah, in this context, I also want to mention a book called Measuring and Managing Performance in Organizations by Rob Austin, where he talks about informational metrics versus motivational metrics. So when you just measure, and if you don't impose targets and incentives on top of what you measure, then those measurements are informational. They provide information and that's it. But the moment you impose a target on a measure, it begins to influence behavior, right? People want to make sure that they hit the target, and they will change their behaviors towards the target and ignore the things that don't have a target around it, right? So it's informational metrics are good, harmless most of the time, but when you turn them into motivational metrics by applying targets and incentives, that's when all this local optimization and other risks come about. And this is also reflected in something called as Goodhart's law. Goodhart was an advisor to the Bank of England, I think in the 70s, and his law basically states when a measure is turned into a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And so when I say reform, how do we, I'll just give you a brief outline of the things that I recommend. Outcome-oriented metrics over activity-oriented ones. We need to get more comfortable with lagging indicators over always relying on leading indicators only. So leading is predictive in nature, lagging is actual. So actual benefits, really, when you do business case planning and you say, I'm going to, by spending so much over the next 3 years, I'm expecting a return of so much over the next 5 years, those are leading indicators. Whereas if you have fast feedback cycles in place which allow you to actually measure real benefits, then you are relying on lagging indicators to take the next step. Adaptability metrics over predictability metrics. This is a slight variation of the above. When we talk about adapting to change over following a plan in the Agile manifesto, the mechanisms that allow us to adapt, they need to be really strong. So for example, in engineering terms, when we have a build pipeline, the existence of the CI loop and the build pipeline is what allows so many people to check in code at the same time and still be assured that we are not going to mess up each other's work. And for this to effectively work, what the build time itself needs to be short. You need to have nothing more than a 10-minute build. If it's 30-minute build, then you are not able to adapt to change, right? So this I call build time as an adaptability metric, as opposed to say a prediction metric is more like if you're talking about say a release plan and you're projecting your burn-up charts and saying, based on this velocity, I think I'm going to be complete with this scope on this date. So in that world, your cycle times, if you are able to achieve good cycle times, then that means your whole development process is much more adaptable. And so even if you find out that something has gone into production and something is missing, you need to quickly, you have an adaptable process. So if you are able to track that as a metric, that is my process adaptable, then it's not so important that you get everything right the first time. And finally, aggregate metrics over fine-grained ones. When we do a lot of too many fine-grained measurements, again there is first of all, it's the cost of maintaining that measurement infrastructure, but also this whole thing about even this is true in code bases. Like you can measure a lot of things like cyclomatic complexity, duplication, and so on. But then one of my colleagues, Eric Dorenberg, he coined this aggregate metric called code toxicity, which aggregates a whole lot of these things. This is sort of like how we do say credit scoring or insurance risk scoring and so on. There are a number of parameters, and then it's not like you have to clear every one of them, right? But you accumulate points as and when you hit these things, and if you have 100 points, you're good to go, right? Something like that. And so these are aggregate metrics, so that it's not important for each and every individual one to be green. But in sum, if you devise some sort of scoring mechanism and you say in sum my threshold should be this much, that's a much better way of using that metric. So next I'll get a little deeper into the first two things, organizing around outcomes, assigning outcome owners. I was, again, a team of us, we were at this insurance company that was developing a claims processing application. And this is an application that's, that has a long life cycle. On one hand, the adjudicators keep using that application. On the other hand, new releases keep coming every quarter or so. And so one particular release, it so happened that that they handed it over to they passed UAT, they handed it over to operations, and then they found that the adjudicators found that the application was not stable enough, and that they used to go through like a 6-page workflow, and it would crash in the middle, and they would raise a ticket, and somebody in operations they can't do much but restart the application. And at some point the operations manager got involved and asked, oh, what can we do? And basically her engineers told her that there isn't much that we can do by ourselves, because it's more of a stability issue. Maybe there are memory leaks or those sort of things, and so really what it needs is the development team needs to take another look at it and provide us with a new release. In the meantime, we can just keep restarting. And again, the organization was structured in such a way that operations manager really did not have that sort of jurisdiction to go to the development side of the organization and say, hey, we need a new release. Now they had a particular release calendar and they were going as per their release calendar. And so it was outside her scope, and so she basically said, but we can't do that, what can we do by ourselves? And they basically wrote a automated job that would poll the application every 2 minutes and restart it if it was dead. So it was just a marginal sort of improvement, and they could put up a dashboard saying we are 99% available. But really, and what is the issue here? It's more around, one, they've organized around activities. So there is a support team which has a very expensive handoff with respect to the development team. And secondly, IT is not organized along outcomes. There is who in IT is responsible for the outcome of effective processing of claims? Nobody. There is somebody who is responsible for putting out another release of the claims processing application, and somebody who is responsible for the uptime of whatever has been delivered. But and this is something that I'm going to come back to when I talk about designing for accountability. But I want to use this to lead into this next slide, which is when we organize along activities, handoffs tend to be much more expensive. When we organize around outcomes, if this were a single, let's say, claims processing team, which had all the people, developers, UX people, maybe product owners, everybody that's needed to achieve that outcome, then any handoffs between them would be much simpler, much more inexpensive. Although the specialists themselves might not be 100% utilized. There might be times when the UX person does not have UX work to do, but that's where in a cross-functional team, people tend to pick up adjacent skills and make themselves useful. And we call these people as T-shaped people, where their skill profile resembles the letter T. They have a lot of depth in one area, but they also begin to acquire some breadth in adjacent areas. But if we start with designing for maximum utilization, then yes, activity-oriented teams, functional organization are the best from that point of view, from a cost efficiency point of view, right? But not from a responsiveness point of view. And responsiveness is in a way nothing but time efficiency. So I think today time efficiency counts for more than cost efficiency. And then the other side effect is it increases the batch size of interaction between teams. When you have to hand over work between teams, you cannot hand over piecemeal sort of work. It has to be a releases worth of functionality to be tested or something like that. And if you have big batch sizes, you can't go fast. Your feedback cycles lengthen, and then we are kind of missing the whole point of doing continuous delivery, right? Which is to shorten feedback loops. And once you are able to shorten the feedback horizon, that's when you can go and try to change the funding model and say, we migrate from long upfront business cases to funding objectives where we can measure feedback and then give the next round of funds and so on. So the next one is, yes, autonomy is great, product-centric teams are great, but how about making sure that they are in line with overall IT strategy, and how do we make sure that there is some accountability in place? So first I'll talk about alignment, and I'll talk about it at 3 levels and a little more on the last one. One is very broad sort of business alignment, business strategy alignment, and in many places it's business strategy is actually not clearly articulated beyond just a mission, vision statement and maybe the plan for the year, and therefore you cannot really derive an IT strategy out of that. But that aside, there is also this notion of the style of play. What is the style of play of the business in the market? And I am referring to a book that was published quite a while back called The Discipline of Market Leaders, where they talk about, a business can choose one of 3 styles of play. It can choose to be product leadership, or customer intimacy, or operational excellence. Right? And this is not just something to be understood at an abstract level. It can actually have implications for day-to-day behavior. For example, if you take ISVs, independent software vendors and internet businesses, it's probably, we can say that they can only be in business if they are product leaders. Yeah. Whereas, if you take enterprise IT, let's take this insurance example. There, I think the value discipline that's more applicable to them is customer intimacy. They have internal stakeholders, the claims adjudicators and the whole business organization. And I think customer satisfaction depends on effective processing of claims. So from that point of view, enterprise IT, once we recognize these things, we as IT leaders can institute some norms of behavior and thereby let some amount of decentralization happen. Because once we kind of agree on the principles of decision making day to day, then the decisions themselves can be delegated much easier. It's only when the principles themselves are not widely shared, then we feel the need to get involved in every decision, and that's where we are not able to give autonomy to teams. The second one is more related to enterprise architecture, operating models, and I'll refer to 2 examples here. And this provides some sort of high-level alignment for IT strategy. The first one is from a book called Enterprise Architecture as a Strategy by the MIT Sloan School, and where they talk about 2 dimensions. One is the standardization dimension and the other is the integration dimension. And when you start off with figuring out where you want to be as a business, what are your standardization and integration needs as a business? There are 4 quadrants, there are 4 quadrants when you draw this: high standardization, high integration, low standardization, low integration, and the other 2 options. And the book actually describes what quadrant is meaningful for what type of business. And that gives us some sort of a high level orientation for enterprise architecture, and then you can use that to drive some sort of alignment on the teams. That is one. There are several, but these are the 2 I refer to. The other one is Gartner's space layering model, where they talk about systems of record, differentiation, innovation. And once you do this classification, then the process by which you select, fund, manage these systems can change based on the category that they belong to. And again, this provides another sort of high level alignment to enterprise IT architecture. But the one that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail is ongoing alignment. Yeah, these sort of things change less frequently. But what about the ongoing alignment? If business stakeholders want to know what are the various teams doing and how does it relate to what I care about? Or if people who are in charge of funding architecture work, they want to know, what is the work that is going on, what are the architectural outcomes it is going to achieve, then you can use this sort of information radiator that I call alignment maps. But before I go there, quick check. We've all talked about, we all know information radiators, right? Like story card walls and so on. So can you name some other information radiators that you use in your organizations?
Failure modes as well.
Sorry?
Failure modes or failure usually.
Failure of?
Whatever we failed, all the things we have experimented.
Okay.
And we failed.
Okay. As a development team or?
Yeah, as an organization.
Or as an organization. Okay, great. Okay.
We have a couple of architecture whiteboards and longer-term roadmaps as well, programs.
Okay. Okay. And how do you like? Do you have like a big monitor to display them, or they are
That's a big whiteboard. So
whiteboards? Okay. Okay.
Those are end-to-end enterprise portfolio, so you can see one view of the entire organization.
Okay. Enterprise portfolio. All right. Nice. So this is good because usually when I ask this question, I get answers like the story card walls, the burn-up charts, say build pipeline monitor, information radiator, production monitoring dashboards, and so on. And they're all good, they're all necessary, but they are also all only belong to development teams and operations teams, right? But when you're talking about organizational agility, where are the rest of the organizational information radiators? And this is something is a quick pulse check of when you're talking about organizational agility. If you get a lot of answers for these sort of radiators that are outside of the use of development and ops teams, then yes, the organization is probably on the right track with respect to organizational agility. So, and referring to alignment map earlier, what it might look like is I have samples coming up, but the model might look like, we say there is business outcomes and they are realized by one or more initiatives that we fund within the organization. And the initiatives are, each initiative, it's good to have an outcome owner named for each initiative, and that person is basically the sponsor for a lot of work that the teams undertake in order to ultimately make a difference to those outcomes. So when you do this for the whole organization as a whole, it might look like a very big, hairy, complicated map, and maybe it makes sense to break down per department depending on the size of your organization. But a global map might look something like this. It's not important to read what's in there. That's just the detail, but it might look like, you have this was done for architecture, but you could do the same thing for business features as well. So you have outcomes, they are realized by what initiatives. It could be architectural initiatives or business initiatives. Who is the owner and what is the work that they have, so to say, sponsored in different teams that is going on to realize those things, right? So this is one global map. It's not a static thing. This could change pretty much, definitely on a monthly basis, if not more than that. We are not going too fine-grained and tracking stories over here, but at a sufficiently high level of granularity. And what it helps people understand what's going on from both ends. From the team's perspective, you could say a team A could be working on those two items out there, this and this one, and that's how the people on the team realize, okay, we are doing this because of this initiative, and that initiative is there to make a difference to those outcomes. So they don't view their job as merely finishing the work items that they are responsible for, but they actually can now think about what we do, is it really going to matter ultimately to those outcomes, and if not, why not? So that's looking at it from this side. From the other side, business often wonders, there's a lot of work going on in IT, but I don't know really why and how I really care about it. And this is when they look from it the other way, provides them some sense of what's happening. A different team might have a different section of the map that's active for them because they're working on different items. So using something like this as an organizational information radiator that's updated on a regular basis provides this is a tool for achieving some sort of strategic alignment for ongoing work, but also it can serve as a periodic status check where business and IT get together and business says, from my point of view, these items are all still red, and IT says, but according to us, the activities that we spun off because of those things, they are probably green, and then they can have the conversation that, okay, if your activities are green, then why are my outcomes red, right? And maybe you realize as a result that maybe you are focusing on the wrong things, or maybe you need to cancel some things and divert the funds to something else, and so on. But it provides a living, breathing information radiator that can serve different purposes and can also serve the purpose of business and IT coming together and having this conversation about whether whatever work IT is undertaking, is it really making a difference to the outcome. So yeah, the next thing is about one way to ensure accountability for outcomes is by designating people as outcome owners, right? But also there are important decisions along the way, and I think it's important to have some accountability for important decisions as well. And that's why instituting this practice of decision ownership and what I call as a decision record. When I talk about this, one typical reaction is, oh, we're talking about single person owning an outcome, single person owning important decisions. This is isn't Agile all about collective ownership, and should we be really going in this direction? And I feel that it's about understanding decision rights versus input rights, yeah. And whether you have it or not, there is. I don't think there is any true collective ownership, even on Agile software development teams. There is always a tech lead who can take a call and who is ultimately accountable for the solution quality. Or there is a product owner who takes a call on what goes into the roadmap and things like that. So there is always, even if it's not formally specified, it is sort of informally understood that there is somebody taking the call. And I think it serves the cause of accountability, because otherwise decisions get often stuck because there is no clear person to take the decision, and sometimes nobody wants to step forward and say, okay, I think we should go this way. Everybody is waiting for the other to say something, and it doesn't again contribute to the cause of IT responsiveness as a whole. And again, on development teams, we are very comfortable assigning accountability. We are very comfortable asking who broke the build, right? And the continuous integration server tells us through the commit logs and all that, okay, it was this commit that. So it may be not always who broke the build, it's also what broke the build, what commit broke the build. And similarly, we should be able to ask who broke the business outcome or what broke the business outcome, right? And we should be able to have an answer to that by means of some sort of a decision record mechanism. And this is also to kind of counterbalance the autonomy that the decision owner has, because if I am a decision owner and there is no decision record, and I know that I am the decision owner, I might feel free to disregard everybody's input and just take whatever decisions I like, and that's not at all healthy. But on the other hand, if there is a decision record and if things don't go as planned, I can be held to account that you had these other inputs, why did you not act upon them, right? And I have to explain. So this is not so much about, it's actually more about organizational learning, right? And it's less about kind of assigning blame, because unless you have these conversations and you have the decision record to understand what really happened, we are very likely to repeat the same behaviors again and again.
Do you have any good examples? I mean, this sounds great stuff. Do you have any good examples, and in particular, how you avoid that blame culture?
Yeah. So. Couple of things, right? So I have another information radiator coming up that sort of addresses this, and let's see if that question is still there at that time. Yeah, and the other thing is, although it's informally understood, in my experience, if there is a hierarchy, it better be explicit and formal. Informal hierarchies actually fare worse, because people are not there. Half the time is spent figuring out who the real decision owner is and what are the dynamics and all that. And it does not really make for a healthy culture, and it slows down decision making, and then you can't be really responsive. So to actually take an example of that, this is again a story from an independent software vendor, where of course the names are all fictitious here. Let's say they have a line of products, and Mary is the product outcome owner for a given product, and say John is the head of sales for the whole line of products. And in this particular case, Mary's product is not selling too well, and they've had a couple of conversations, and there is a difference of opinion. Mary feels that her particular product is different and it needs a different sales approach than what, and John seems to be using a sort of a cookie cutter approach for all the line of products. Whereas John certainly doesn't agree. He feels that his sales people tell him that during pre-sales demos and so on, they find that it has poor usability, user experience, it's not documented well, and it doesn't really, maybe the competitor products are much better and so on. And so John feels it's really about the product itself and not about how we are selling it. But there is no, they might have a common boss somewhere higher up in the hierarchy, but that person is not dedicated full time to realizing this outcome, right? So there is no real outcome owner here for the product as a whole. There is a, the outcome really has been broken up as, for the product there is a sales outcome, there is a customer satisfaction outcome, and there is a product quality outcome. And Mary is probably responsible for quality and John is responsible for sales, but nobody is really in a position to take a call for the product as a whole, as a full-time dedicated member. And generally in these situations, you know, things just kind of work out their own course until some sort of eventuality. And this is a very tricky exercise. This is the most, I get the most resistance for this sort of exercise, which is that let's map out the one on the top right, let's map out the outcomes, right? And let's make sure that while we are mapping, we don't drill down to the level of activity, so we don't go into like development, testing and so on, but we still stay focused at the level of outcomes. And then let's assign who is the outcome owner for these things. And once we have assigned that, that person has the decision rights. Everybody else has input rights, and they have a right for their input to be considered, but it is this person who has the decision rights. And this is a very tricky sort of exercise because the people in place, they are already in place because of various reasons, right? There may be some people who were hired because of a talent crunch, or they were promoted because they didn't, just to keep them happy and prevent them from leaving and so on. And so positions have been carved out for them, and in the process there is no clear separation of rights and responsibilities. And in that situation, when you attempt to do this, it creates a lot of tension, and people generally want to step away from this. But really, from a decision-making responsiveness point of view, it really starts from here. And the larger the organization, the more difficult it is to get somebody to agree to this sort of exercise. But in my opinion, you have to start here. And
so sorry if I'm throwing too many questions.
Yeah, no problem.
How does this work with the Scrum model of a full-time product owner who actually has to be accountable during product and actually tech product development, and effectively the chief product owner, the executive product owner needs to delegate accountability to that person who needs to be working with a product development team, whereas on a software basis, but then you've got Mary, who's the head of product X, who has to do a whole bunch of stuff and can't sit the product development team.
Yeah.
So does that actually square with that, or do you have some sort of issues with delegation accountability?
Well, I would say, like people up the hierarchy are always nominally accountable for everything that falls under their organization. But the people who are full-time dedicated to that outcome realization, they really need to have the decision rights. And on occasion, they can be overridden by their bosses. But in a good sort of situation, those overrides will be rare. And if you see that overrides happening too often, then there is something wrong in between. Maybe the wrong person is on the job, or the delegation is not effective enough. Yeah. So I've actually covered the major areas. There are other areas that I'm not talking about, but which are also crucial: metrics, finance, staffing, tooling. Tooling is often ignored when it comes to organizational agility, but I feel the attitude towards tooling in an organization. So for example, access to information systems. Do you provide access only on a need to use basis, or do you invert it and say, you know what, I'm going to restrict access only on a need to restrict basis, right? And I'm going to open up everything else. Similarly, how does procurement work? Is the procurement department trying to procure the minimum number of licenses necessary? Like it happens a lot with, like if you say marketing automation, there are so many tools that you have to buy licenses for today. And if you buy in a cross-functional team, if you say, okay, I have a cross-functional team of 12 people, but only one of them is a marketing person, so I'll assign one license to this team, then although you have eliminated silos from the org chart and you have put a product-centric team in place, but with respect to tooling, there are still silos because there is only one person in the team who has access to that information. Everybody has to go through that. And so there is actually quite a bit of tooling related dysfunction that or barriers to organizational agility that can come about. And so what I'm really talking about here is, the path to business agility also ultimately requires organizational agility. You may start with Scrum and that will take you to UAT at best, and then you have to do CD, so continuous delivery, and DevOps. That will take you to production. You have covered the last mile, but you have not yet touched the product management organization, and that's where you start doing product-centric teams, reorganizing your departments, creating cross-functional, outcome-oriented, long-lived teams, and that takes you much further. But really, when you're talking about changing the funding mechanisms, changing the attitude towards metrics, and changing how we look at tooling, etc., that really falls into the realm of organizational agility, and it requires all of this to ultimately go towards being an agile business. And so, in the book, I basically, in all the chapters, you use these as the 3 guiding principles, although I've mostly talked about organizing for responsiveness over cost efficiency. But there are, for all the recommendations, basically these are the 3 principles that I think apply today. Governing for value over predictability, responsiveness over efficiency, and designing for intrinsic motivation, autonomy, mastery, purpose, and unscripted collaboration. And if we internalize these principles, then we can evaluate the design of our organizations to see whether they are set up for organizational agility or not. And businesses, and of course, this is probably a lot of fundamental change. It cannot, unless IT leadership is bought in and kind of ready to go with this fundamental change, it's unlikely to happen. But then there are agile businesses that realize that you have to do this fundamental change, because change in technology and business is the order of the day. So we either embrace change or be safe and sorry.